Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. I want to thank Dr. Amy Nunn for joining us earlier, talking about the state's response to the monkeypox public health issue. But I want to go right down to the University of Virginia. Dr. Jennifer Lawless, she's the chair of the political science department. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, never a dull day.
Never a dull day. There is a lot going on in Washington, D.C. I actually want to start in Asia. For the first time ever, Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump actually probably share the same point of view of poking the proverbial Chinese bear. Did Pelosi make a mistake, or was that a good strategy?
I think once she decided that she was going, she really had no choice. Once you say you're going to Taiwan, and it seems clear that China doesn't want you to go to Taiwan, if you back down, you've placated China. So once she doubled down, she really had no choice. It's one of these rare opportunities where Democrats and Republicans in Congress are, applauding her efforts, and the trip seems to have been quite successful. So I think long term and short term, it was probably the right decision, although it was a somewhat risky one.
It seems like a country that steals our IP, has no respect for almost anything we ask for, is supporting Russia and the Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure I totally get the downside of poking that bear.
Well, I think part of the downside of poking that bear is linked to global commerce and general stability in the region. They could be doing a lot more to support Russia. They could also be doing a lot more to hurt the global economy. And so the extent to which relations can be in, sort of détente status is much more desirable than creating a situation where they're actively, on Russia's side. So it could be a lot worse than it is. That said, given the human rights abuses that we've seen over the course of decades, given the economic instability that they're willing to generate, given the threats that they make, militarily, I'm not, like most people, very satisfied with the relationship, but you can imagine how much worse it could be.
Okay, let's go to Joe Biden. Joe Biden's had, for what appears to be a really strong 10, 15 days. I will put aside the jokes that he should get COVID more often, because it has been probably his best 2 weeks in office. But as successful as he's been on a host of fronts, both domestically and on a foreign policy standpoint, legislatively, public policy, et cetera, his approval ratings continue a downward momentum. Jen Psaki is gone. Does he need to just blow up that press room and start anew?
I think it's two things. I think the first is that people are, and we've known this for decades, people assess the president based on how they feel economically. And although gas prices have been going down steadily, they're still very high. Although inflation is not 20%, it's approaching it. And although unemployment is very low, we're seeing interest rates go up, and they're beginning to be a slowing of the housing market. And so the president is held responsible for the economy, regardless of whether he or she can do anything about it. And in this case, it seems like the administration has done as much as they can, and they're continuing to be creative about additional ways to address economic problems, but the American people don't really care. So that's part of it. He's facing a ceiling, and unfortunately for him, that ceiling is very, very low in terms of approval ratings. The second has to do with the fact that he has been in isolation for much of the last 15 days, and although he's able to make he's able to have press conferences and speak to the American people, it's not the same as actually being out there and seeing coverage linked to actual successes with people generating the kind of energy that might be enough to cause at least a small uptick. So as when he's completely free from the COVID relapse, maybe we'll see a little bit more of that. But I think it really comes down to the economy. And given that we're seeing gas prices drop pretty precipitously, and we're seeing the approval rating continue to drop too, it suggests that it's this bigger macroeconomic picture, and the American people blame Joe Biden.
Okay, a week ago, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, struck a deal with President Manchin on major legislation. I say it in jest. Obviously, the senator from West Virginia has been a major. He's sort of the decision maker on what moves through the Senate because he's such a linchpin vote. So they get Manchin, but they forgot to get Sinema, the senator from Arizona.
I don't know if they forgot to get Sinema or they opted not to get Sinema. They knew that Manchin was going to be the harder sell.
Plug in for 1 second. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I don't know if they forgot to get Sinema or they just opted not to get Sinema. Manchin is the harder sell. Manchin is also the person who was seen as being the final no vote to prevent any real change, any real bill from going through. The other reason that Sinema might have seemed less important is because she had been a Green Party environmental activist, right? The idea that she would single-handedly stop what could be a really meaningful climate change bill seems somewhat unlikable. So, we saw Joe Manchin having a conversation with Kristen Sinema on the floor the other day. My bet is that she's going to come around. I think the optics don't look great, and it marginalizes her and diminishes her power. But at the end of the day, I think what we've seen is a deal that will likely pass.
Does this get passed in the United States Senate next week?
I'm sorry?
Does this climate change legislation, a major piece of legislation, has implications up and down the, both from an environmental standpoint and an economic standpoint? Does that bill get passed in the U.S. Senate next week?
I think so. Because there are 49 votes for it. I can't imagine any scenario whereby Kirsten Sinema is ultimately going to put corporate taxes above meaningful climate change.
Let's jump over to Tuesday night's primary results, which had somewhat shocking results on two different levels. First of all, folks in Kansas voted overwhelmingly, 60-40, to retain legal abortion in that state. Kansas is a Republican red state. How shocked were you with that outcome?
I was shocked by the margin. The pro-choice groups did a really good job making sure that independents voted and defeated this. So I think it should send shockwaves through the system to Republicans who thought that they were going to sort of coast to victory because of this issue. And to those who thought that, well, Republicans have generally been the ones that are more active around this issue. Well, the pendulum has swung because the right no longer exists. And so Democrats and independents, if we believe what we saw in Kansas is, a harbinger of what's to come, they're going to get out and vote. And that could fundamentally change some of the projections regarding both the House and the Senate.
Okay, let's go to the other issue. A series, almost a clean sweep, for really extremist pro-Trump candidates in a host of different states, not exclusively, but overwhelming number of them, election deniers. I mean, we're talking extremist right-wing Republican Trumpites did very well and beat mainstream Republicans over and over again, including those supported by Mike Pence. Yeah,
and so there are two pieces of this that I think are important. The first is that being an election denier and being somebody who is still perpetuating the big lie does not in any way disqualify you for winning a primary for any office. We've seen these people now garner primary nominations for governor, senator, secretary of state, attorney general, across the board and across the country. The second is that the Democratic Governors Association played a role in getting some of these people elected. Now, the strategy is one that might make sense, right? They wanted, especially in purple states and in purple districts, to elevate these election deniers who were extremist candidates because the Democrats would then have a better shot defeating them in the general election because they were too extreme for the district. The problem is that they're on the ticket and they could potentially win. And then the Democrats are going to have to deal with the fact that they helped propel those victories. The other thing that the Democrats have to deal with is that in some of these cases, Michigan is one example, they knocked off Republicans who were willing to who did vote to impeach Donald Trump. And so, they're playing with fire, and I see the reasons why, but at the end of the day, we've learned that elections can generate results that nobody anticipates, and it might be the case that the Democrats have now propelled some of these candidates along in a way where they could ultimately win. We'll see what happens.
The DCCC piling in $400,000 in the mayor's race. Here's a guy who voted to impeach, Republican, moderate, maybe even liberal Republican, voted to impeach the president, voted for the gun control, voted for gay rights, and the margin of victory just being a couple points. That $400,000 of Democratic money, I just don't even understand it, may blow up on the DCCC.
Right. I mean, what they're hoping is that because of redistricting, that district is now bluer than it had been. And so by defeating him, they're positioning a Democrat to take that over. And so, they're looking at the map, and I think in a lot of ways they're doing what Republicans have always done. They're not thinking about the people, they're not thinking about the players, they're thinking about the election math. And
they're not thinking about ethics, they're not thinking about right and wrong, they're not thinking about America. But
I mean, I've been a big proponent of saying for years and years and years that I wish the Democratic Party would be as cynical and as, be willing to play as hard as the Republican Party did. And this time they did, and I'm nervous. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, right. Sounds like a good idea, but in reality, and what are you giving up? I mean, what you're running for is decency and being a party of the people, and then and supporting democracy. And then
it's true, but you're also, but none of those things matters if from the perspective of the Democrats, none of those things matters if the Democrats lose control of the House. So this was an opportunity to do everything that they possibly could to sort of build a little bit of a cushion against what they assume are going to be pretty devastating losses.
Let's go to the House and Senate. Start in the Senate first. This Senate race, this control of the United States Senate, we have a 50-50 margin right now. The vice president breaks the ties. We've got a number of key races around the country. If you were to crystal ball this, whatever, we're out in 90-something days out, how does this U.S. Senate end up? Do the Democrats keep control, or does it flip red?
I think the Democrats could keep control, but if they do, it would probably be a 50-50 Senate still, right? So it's not like if they maintain control, they're going to have any easier a path whereby Joe Manchin won't still be pivotal on every single decision, for example. But I do think given some of the candidates the Republicans are putting up, the Democrats have a much better shot than might otherwise be the case. I just read an analysis also compared to 2012 and 2014. Many of the Republican candidates that are running are novice candidates. So it's not like the Republicans have put up, really qualified, high-profile candidates who have political experience in some of these races, and that might ultimately help the Democrats.
Democrats pick up Pennsylvania, Pat Toomey, a Rhode Islander, LaSalle graduate, who's retiring. Do the Democrats pick up that seat?
I think it's likely. It seems that race is becoming increasingly, Fetterman is becoming a much more visible candidate, and it's clear that the DSCC is prioritizing that. They need that. If they can't win that race, it's over.
And then what seat is most likely to be lost to the Republicans?
So I think all seats are in play. I don't want to suggest that there's any particular seat that could be lost. So I'm going to remain silent on that one.
Jump over to the House. It was looking like a month ago, really before Roe v. Wade gets overturned, that Republicans were just going to pick up maybe 30 or 40 seats in the House. I know your projections are not that high, but other pundits were scorecarding it maybe even that high. Where are we now?
Oh, I don't think we'll be anywhere close to that, but it's very difficult to think about a scenario whereby the Democrats maintain control. Now, I think a really, really disciplined general election campaign where the focus is only on purple districts And the focus in those districts is really linked to abortion rights and the fact that the Republicans are complete extremists on this issue and are not even willing to make exceptions in the cases of rape, incest, and the life of the mother, where 86 or 87% of the American people do believe in those exceptions, could help and could ultimately even win the day. I just think it's very unlikely that there is going to be as disciplined a national campaign and as focused a national campaign as would be required to make that work.
Bring that right to Rhode Island. The 2nd Congressional District is in play. It's the first time the seat's been open since 2010 when Patrick Kennedy retired and David Cicilline won a close race against John Laughlin. Now it's 2022. Alan Fung is going to be the Republican nominee. Very popular, high name recognition, lost 2 close races for governor, has a pretty successful resume from being mayor of Cranston for 12 years. He is likely to face Seth Magaziner, general treasurer for 8 years, and fairly successful as general treasurer. What's that race look like right now in the 2nd Congressional District?
I think it's a toss-up right now, but I think Magaziner needs to make the case that even if you like Alan Fung, even if you like Alan Fung's policies, even if you believe that Alan Fung is pro-choice enough and pro-gun control enough and anti-Trump enough, that at the end of the day, electing Alan Fung means a vote for Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House if the Republicans gain control. And electing Alan Fung means a vote for Republican committee chairs across the board. And those Republicans who are in Congress are not pro-choice enough, and they're not gun control enough, and they're not anti-Trump enough. And that's what Magaziner is going to have to hammer home. If Alan Fung can make this race about himself and not about the Republicans in Washington, he's got a shot.
Can Alan Fung also win this on a different argument? That the argument you're talking about is sort of the Sheldon Whitehouse versus Link Chafee 2006 race. But
I knew something about that cycle.
But can he also make the argument, Alan Fung, that listen, Republicans are going to control the House. It's way better to have a moderate Republican who's a decision maker and an influencer on the leadership, the majority party, than send a freshman Seth Magaziner who literally will have the ranking from a political power standpoint of 435th. I mean, we're talking about somebody who could be in the game as a freshman because of the margin versus somebody who is going to have no political stature.
He's not going to be in the game because he's too moderate. In order for him to get into the game, he would have to sell out on all of his principles. And so I think that's the reason that that argument falls flat. The other thing that I would say is he's not going to be pivotal. There are going to be, if the Republicans take control, there are going to be a handful of people who the Republicans can lose on every single vote. And if it's Alan Fung, it's not going to matter. So Alan Fung is not the new Joe Manchin.
Is that your new tagline?
Yes.
Alan Fung is not the new Joe Manchin.
Yes, get it on the T-shirt.
Joe Manchin is president of the United States, so if Alan Fung were to rise to the point of being a Joe Manchin, he could potentially be vice president. He'd actually have more power.
Obviously.
What should people be looking for? We're not in the cycle of January 6th, although it does look like the Justice Department is very, very active in issuing subpoenas to very important people in the Trump organization. Where are we, and what should people be looking at over the next week or so?
Well, I think the additional leaks coming from the Justice Department and who else they're speaking to, the other cases across the country, especially in Georgia regarding Trump. Trump and Ivanka Trump are being deposed. They're going to have to answer questions under oath about the value of the Trump organization. This is something that Trump has notoriously lied about. You can't do that when you're under oath. And so I think that we're going to continue to hear, even if it's not going to be public televised hearings from the committee, we're going to continue to hear additional information from the committee as well as the Justice Department and Georgia and New York. So I would focus on that. The other thing that I would focus on is whether Biden is able to get this climate change win over the course of the next couple of weeks, because if so, it makes it a lot easier for Democrats to argue that over the course of the last 2 years, these have been the legislative successes that the Democrats have been able to accomplish. And it's no longer about comparing what they've accomplished to what the original Build Back Better version would have been. It's now about comparing what they accomplished to what Republicans will do if they take control. And that's an argument that the Democrats, I think, if done well, could win.
Let me just go to Donald Trump. With all these cases still flying around, zooming around, is Donald Trump ever going to be prosecuted in any way, shape, or form by any of these different legal entities?
I hope so. I think so. I mean, as you know, Congress can't. They can recommend. The Justice Department can. Merrick Garland has been harsher over the course of the last couple of weeks in terms of his rhetoric about the fact that nobody is above the law, even a presidential candidate. So I don't think that there's no way that it will happen. I do think that if it is going to happen, the evidence is going to have to be ironclad. But I think it's likely that he will be indicted. I don't know whether he'll ever go to jail.
With that, thanks everybody for joining us. Professor Lawless, thank you as always. Stay tuned for much, much more. It's all going on. It's also steaming hot out. If you're going to enjoy the weather, take good care of yourself. It's about 95 degrees, 100% with the 100 degrees with the index. Stay safe. If you haven't got that booster shot, be like Joe Biden, get that booster shot, and at least get you a nice room at the west wing of the White House for 10 days, and you can relax there as well. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.